Hello, everyone. I'm John Greco, founder and chair of the Marketing Impact Council. Welcome to the COVID-19 Reset, Behavioral Change, a Growth Opportunity. This is the third in a series of complimentary council webinars organized and produced in collaboration with our strategic partner, CommunicationsMatch, whose founder and CEO, Simon Erskine-Locke, is co-moderating with me today. For those of you who may have missed either of the first two webinars, written recaps and videos are available on both the Council and CommunicationsMatch sites. Now, today's program will be the last in this round of complimentary webinars on the reset. Simon and I would like to recognize and thank our supporting partners, including ComproBiz, the Financial Communication Society, and Capital Communicator. Before we begin today's webinar, just a few words about the Council. The idea of growth and value is at the heart of the Marketing Impact Council. Our value equation is actually an acronym and a mnemonic for vision, alignment, leadership, understanding, and execution across functions. These 5 drivers must be continuously optimized and integrated to create, grow, and maintain the maximum value for all stakeholders and apply to both for-profit and nonprofit entities. We provide members tools and access to resources to unlock value, such as this webinar, that help council members address the question, if you only had $1 more, how would you invest it to create the greatest sustainable impact on the value of your entity and brand? We hope that each of you who are not already members of the council will join our community so that we can continue to assist you in navigating these uncharted waters. Please visit our website, mktgimpactcouncil.com, to learn more about the benefits of membership. Simon, would you like to say a few words about CommunicationsMatch?
Sure, thanks, John. And thank everyone for joining today's webinar. So CommunicationsMatch is an agency, consultant, and freelancer search platform with 6,000 agencies and professionals. And it allows companies to find agencies, professionals, and freelancers that match by industry expertise, capabilities, location, size, and many other things, including diversity. We have an agency, the industry's first actually RFP tools called Agency Select that helps streamline the hiring process. And we have resources on the platform, and we also offer services, basically with the goal of helping streamline the search process for agencies and consultants to find the ones that match the needs and generate leads for those who are actually on the platform. More can be found actually at communicationsmatch.com. Thanks.
Thank you, Simon. Now, we're delighted to have with us today 3 outstanding experts who are extraordinarily qualified to address the very core of today's topic. Michael Solomon is an international speaker, renowned marketing expert with a PhD in social psychology, professor of marketing at St. Joseph's University, and author of books including Consumer Behavior, Buying, Having, and Being, the most widely used book on the subject in the world. He is an industry consultant who advises a wide array of global clients in a variety of leading industries. He regularly appears on network television shows to comment on consumer issues and is frequently quoted in major media outlets. Michael always finds a way to combine cutting-edge academic theory with actionable real-world strategies. Leslie Zane is president and founder of Trigger's Growth Strategy. Over the past 25 years, the company has developed a proven track record in significantly accelerating revenue growth and driving consistent success through its unique expertise in changing instinctive brand purchase. Before founding Trigger, she worked in brand management for Revlon, J&J, P&G, Avon, and Bain. With a BA from Yale and an MBA from Harvard Business School, she is widely published and a frequent speaker, including TEDx. Stephan Wiedner is CEO and co-founder of Noomii, the world's largest network of coaches, whose purpose is to unleash the collective potential of people to solve the world's biggest challenges through data-driven coaching initiatives. Now, in 2019, Noomii partnered with the Fearless organization to certify the first global cohort of leadership coaches on the psychological safety scan, as developed by Harvard professor Amy C. Edmondson, who, as many of you may recall, was a panelist on the first webinar in this series. Stephan has been a certified coach for nearly 20 years and has numerous accreditations. Thank you, Michael, Leslie, and Stephan for being with us today. As we now turn to our panel, let me remind our audience to feel free to submit questions through the Q&A area in your screen, and we'll do our best to address some of those questions later in the program. Now, in the context of the theme, the COVID-19 reset, behavioral change, a growth opportunity, and the visual that we created for this webinar that depicted the crossroads that all of us are at as both consumers as well as business and brand leaders, there are many, many obvious behavior changes that we can all relate to in our own lives as a result of COVID-19 that are absolutely killing businesses and entire industries. The negative impact is much easier for many to see, at least on the surface. But some of the opportunities for growth may not be so obvious. So Michael, let me start with you. Before we ever heard of COVID-19, your book, Marketers Tear Down These Walls, provided great context for how we all needed to reset our traditional thinking about consumer behavior. And that was before COVID-19. How has COVID-19 impacted your thinking on this topic and the extent of the reset that's now required?
Well, thanks, John, and thanks for including a fuzzy-headed academic on this great panel. I appreciate it. Yeah, as you pointed out, when I wrote that book last year, of course, that was before the virus, and I guess one of the points in that book was that we're on the verge, or we've already experienced some major disruptions in terms of how consumers relate to marketers. And one of the things about something like this, I think it was Winston Churchill who first said something to the effect of "never waste a good crisis." And I think what he meant by that is that what happens in this kind of situation is that you've got some disruptions, you've got some changes that are kind of brewing there, and it's really like pouring gasoline on a fire. So what the pandemic does, for better or worse, is to really accelerate changes that were in the offing already, and that can be at a somewhat micro level, like retailers like JCPenney, for example, who have been teetering for years. Maybe this is just enough to push them over the brink. But even at a more macro level, what we see is that some very important disruptions have been accelerated. And I think everybody who is listening can probably list a few of these. One is obviously income inequality. We're seeing a lot about that. The acceptance of automation in marketing and retailing, still some pushback in terms of fears about job losses and so on, but people are much more willing perhaps to delegate certain tasks to robots who don't tend to catch the kind of virus that we worry about. And more generally, something I dwelled on in that book is the increasing amount of market fragmentation that we have that makes traditional market segmentation strategies probably, in some cases, a bit obsolete. So we see this now. It's fascinating to see differences in how consumers, for example, are responding to the virus. Are they wearing masks? Are they going out to bars and restaurants and so on? Some people are dug in on one side and others are determined to go out and act like nothing has happened, et cetera. So I think, the best metaphor for me is, and many listeners might be aware of this in the context of management theory. There was a famous social psychologist named Kurt Lewin who had an influential perspective basically on freezing and refreezing. And so the metaphor is great, I think, because basically what you want to do is imagine a block of ice, like a snowball or something. And that's how we are, in normal times, where everybody is kind of frozen in their habits. Consumers have certain ways of doing things. We know that they're very resistant to changing those things unless there's a really good reason to do so. Then something really, really significant happens, like a pandemic, for example, and that ice starts to unfreeze. And that is an opportunity and a challenge. When we start to unfreeze, that means we become more receptive at that point suddenly to reconsidering how we do things. And so we've seen that, for example, with financial services or grocery delivery, where a lot of people who didn't maybe do this, using a mobile device before, are forced into doing this. And so, at least some of them are saying, you know what, this isn't a bad way to do my banking, or this is a great way to do my grocery shopping and so on. And so we start to see that a bunch of habits now will change until the refreezing starts. And then those new habits will get frozen into place. So I think what happens is we're clearly in an unfreezing time right now. Nobody knows when that refreezing will happen. We hope it will happen fairly soon. That is when we get back to the so-called new normal, at least. But what's been fascinating to me is to watch how the virus has now unlocked a lot of people, and they're really in a fluid state. So it is a challenge, obviously, for all of us, but it's also an opportunity, I think, for a lot of marketers to now be able to get in, especially if they didn't, let's say, have, if they weren't leading in market share for whatever reason earlier, they might have opportunities to do that now because we're in a very fluid state.
And Michael, when you think about the behavior changes that you're talking about, the fluidness, the thawing, the refreezing, et cetera, are there particular, whether they're above the line or below the line behavior changes, particular shifts that you believe are going to really present the greatest growth opportunities over the long term? I mean, I think there's some that'll be obvious in the quick spikes, but the question is, are they sustainable? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I do. I think I've kind of identified, I've actually even used a cute little acronym of putting your foot on the gas, GAS. I think that there's 3 pillars of consumer behavior. There may be more, but there's 3 pillars of consumer behavior that are very, very salient right now. G is gratification, A is agency, and S is stability. So people are looking for gratification. Obviously, we're all like caged animals at this point. Everybody's ready to get out of lockdown and so on. Lots of opportunities to find new ways for people to feel good, and that might be as simple as, again, a new behavior like a Zoom happy hour, and I'm sure we've all experienced those. So lots of interesting opportunities there. Agency, and by agency, I mean it in the psychological sense of establishing a sense of control, feeling of control. In a pandemic like this, we feel very out of control. We just don't know what's going to happen next. And so people are looking to reestablish agency. Early on in the crisis, we saw this with hoarding behavior. I think a lot of the reason that people suddenly had to buy, 18,000 rolls of toilet paper is that at least that is something that they could control. So I think there are opportunities for companies that provide a sense of agency. Obviously, hygienically related companies, cleaning supplies, things like that allow you to at least maintain control over your home environment. That's a good example of that. And the third pillar is stability. So again, in times of uncertainty, we want to look to the familiar. So people are less willing to take risks in general. And we know that a lot of consumer behavior is driven by the desire or willingness to take a risk, because every purchase decision we make has some risk involved. So companies that basically minimize risk, we're not going to see a lot of novelty seeking. Ironically, I think one way it's good for some companies is we might see actually a rebound in brand loyalty, which has been going way, way, way down, as everyone knows, for the last decade or longer, as people rebound and they want to be surrounded by things that are not new, but things that they're comfortable with. So a great example of this, if you're selling comfort foods, like macaroni and cheese and things like that, you're doing very well right now, because that's the kind of things that people want to re-inject back into their routine. So again, I think those three pillars, I'm not saying those are the only things, but if you look at opportunities there, those are three basic values or drivers that I think present an enormous amount of opportunity.
That's great. Leslie, let me turn to you in the context of some of what Michael has described here, and as you think about all of your work and the clients that you work with and just how you're seeing the world evolve. We hear the term the new normal quite a bit. We actually had one of our prior panelists, Rashad Tabakawala from Publicis, described it as the new strange instead of the new normal. What does the new normal mean to you and look like to you?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me, and welcome to the whole audience. I hope everybody in the audience is staying safe and feels healthy and well. What the new normal means to me is that we have evolved. There is no going back. This is the most massive behavior change in modern history. Our attitudes and our behavior are changing at the same time, and that's when you know that it's gonna stick. If you kind of think about when you were a kid and you were studying and your mom was telling you how to remember things, she told you to think about it in your head and write it down. And so at this time, we're both changing our attitudes and our rituals simultaneously. That's how you know that something is gonna stick with you. So it's not really a question of if we're gonna change, it's a question of how much. And I will offer you yet another metaphor, not the ice, but the metaphor that I'll offer you is the metaphor of a sapling that grows into a tree. The way our instincts form is through associations in our subconscious that form on branches. And if you think about how COVID started, it was a mere sapling. We were hearing stories about COVID coming from this place called Wuhan. Most of us didn't know what that place was. Little by little, those stories seeped into our subconscious, and they accumulated more and more and more and grew and grew and grew, but we weren't really aware of them at the beginning. We weren't conscious of them, sort of like the frog in the pot. You throw a frog into boiling water and it jumps out because it doesn't want to be cooked. But if you throw the frog into lukewarm water and slowly raise the temperature, then you can cook it. And that's how it was with COVID. These were stories seeping into our subconscious, and they accumulated. And now, and by the way, nobody really was aware of it or conscious of it, even our global leaders. They weren't paying any attention to it, enough attention to it, until it was too late, until that COVID, all those associations were in their face. And at that point, it was really too little too late. So that's how we know that these associations are sticking. They are becoming part of our subconscious ecosystem. And what companies need to do is understand that we're in a continuous state of evolution. And if you don't understand the nature of this transformation, you're going to be like, one of these guys that grabs your hand instead of offering up an elbow.
And Leslie, you've written about something called the Kovac Connectome. What exactly is that Kovac Connectome, and how does it help business leaders understand customer behavior going forward?
So beneath every set of behaviors that you witness on the outside, there is a collection of instincts that live in our subconscious, and they form on branches, collections of associations. So there is this ecosystem of associations that I've called the Kovac Connectome. And it is made up today, from what we've seen in our research, it's sort of like a tree that's made up of two very large clusters. One cluster is our preserving cluster, and that has all kinds of associations that relate to being risk averse. It's our survival instinct that is driving that particular part of the connectome. And in there are all the concerns about health and safety, and that is what's causing people not to want to spend now. And it's really actually explaining why we're in recessionary times. The other part of the connectome is our preserving connectome. And that's driven by another human instinct, the desire to move forward, to survive, to get out there and do things and make progress. And what we're seeing in our research is that these two connectomes these two clusters of connectomes are fighting against each other, like these two forces are fighting for dominance in our brain. And the question is, who's going to win? You know, which side is going to win? Right now, the preserving part of the connectome is larger and more robust and has more associations. And that's why we're in recessionary times. In order to get into a recovery, the persevering part of the connectome needs to grow larger. And it turns out that you can almost think about this as the underpinning of the consumer confidence index, because the consumer confidence index is the outcome, feeling confident. That's sort of the end result. What lies beneath it is these forces that are competing against each other for dominance. Companies actually have a role in helping our economy recover. Companies can actually help build positive associations on the persevering side of the connectome and make that grow larger, accelerate that change. And if we all do that together collectively, we can actually help the economy improve. And we need to, because this is the Kovac Connectome is a barometer of the health of our economy. And right now, our health is in quarantine.
So with that backdrop of the way we think about things and the way our brains process this, are there particular messages? What types of messages have been successful in your opinion in terms of during COVID-19 and which ones have not?
Well, one of the things we're seeing is that while companies are making a valiant attempt to be empathetic, that all of this emotional expression is not really doing much for them. It's a lot of white noise. The messages are kind of going in one ear and out the other, to be frank. That doesn't mean you don't want to be empathetic, but many of the messages aren't coming off as being genuine. They don't seem like true empathy. They seem more like pandering. Oh, we're in this together, tremendous uncertainty, even though we're apart, we're really together. They don't strike consumers as true expressions of empathy. What does strike people as true and honest and genuine is when companies do things that actually relate to their own expertise. So examples would be, Bacardi and Pernod Ricard and Absolut making hand sanitizer out of ethanol. That is a kind of contribution that sticks because it's genuine. It's what they do for a living, and people know that. And so we're finding things like that. Federal Express shipping ventilators across the country. Again, those kinds of things stick because they relate to their expertise. Contrary to popular belief, pure emotional expressions, not just during COVID, but at any time, actually don't build business. It's the combination of emotion tied back to your brand expertise and building lots of positive associations. That's the definition of emotional connection. Emotion is an outcome that the consumer needs to own, not an input that you express and force people to feel.
Well, that's great, thank you. And before I turn to Stephan, because I want to really get the perspective from the leadership team from him on this, but Michael, I want to turn back to you just with that background and context as well, in terms of your perspective on how brands should navigate through the process of identifying and really evaluating and executing on opportunities for growth in this new world that we all find ourselves in. Is there a process that you think they ought to be following to do that?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, Leslie's a very, very smart person, because I totally agree with everything she said. The authenticity, it's kind of an overused word already, but that's what people are looking for. And a lot of these messaging attempts, I think, have not only been ineffective, they've actually boomeranged and come back to bite the companies, like some companies like McDonald's, Procter and Gamble, that have come off sounding, you know, there's a disconnect between what they're saying and what they're doing. And, you know, consumers have a pretty good BS detector. They can kind of pick up when you're just, you know, talking the talk, but not walking the walk. And actually, this is a very good time for brands to reclaim some of their agency, because actually, you know, in some research I've seen, you know, especially as some people feel that governments have kind of let them down in terms of their response to the, you know, to the coronavirus, people are saying that they expect brands to step up and really take the place of governments, and they're looking for brands to take that kind of leadership position. And concurrently, you have some threats, I think, to the whole influencer, you know, industry that has sprung up, that has become so influential, if you will, because a lot of these so-called influencers have really shot themselves in the foot by, you know, posting about their retreats to the Hamptons or something like that when everybody else is stuck in quarantine. And so they're a little bit shaky right now. And so there's a great opportunity for brands to reclaim more of the narrative that I think they've surrendered over the last 10 years or so. And the other thing is, I think that, you know, a lot of companies are they're watching the poll numbers, you know, and they're kind of like a politician that doesn't know what he or she is going to say until they see the poll numbers that day. And they really need to be more proactive rather than reactive, and to get out there. And especially what Leslie was saying, and I think what I was saying about, you know, maybe, you know, with Leslie's sapling, you know, this is an opportunity to kind of train the way that tree grows, which is, I think, where Leslie was going with that metaphor. You know, you have that opportunity to get in early and take a leadership position. And if you're seen as just a follower and a Me Too, I mean, we have another, you know, Me Too in another context, but that is not what consumers are looking for. There's a gap in leadership, I think, that consumers are looking for brands to fill. And that window is going to close at some point. But right now, through this, you know, kind of unfreezing period that I'm referring to, this is the perfect opportunity for a brand to step up. And again, they have to be sincere about it. And as Leslie said, they have to actually do stuff that's in their wheelhouse, that shows that they're not just saying nice things about Black Lives Matter or whatever the cause happens to be.
So Stephan, with all of that context on the consumer and client side and behavioral side, when you look at this from the Noomii perspective and the work that you've done with and do with so many companies and leadership teams and through your network, what changes in behavior do you believe are required on the part of leadership teams as they work to integrate their business strategy, their marketing and communications, to really proactively engage in any of the growth opportunities that we think may be there? What's got to change on the part of those leadership teams to really take that on and be up to the task?
John, thanks for having me on as a panelist. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here. And to answer your question, what we're seeing in the market is, I think there's been an evolving shift in what leadership means and how leaders perceive their role within companies. And go back years ago, there was more of a command and conquer type mentality with leadership. And now what we're seeing is a lot more leaders wanting to be empathetic, as Leslie mentioned, and wanting to really listen to their customers, listen to their people, as well as the audience out there, the consumers. And that shift has led to a lot more humility as leaders. And I think that's really needed. If you look at Amy Edmondson's work around the fearless organization, one of the key elements of a leader is humility, or specifically she talks about situational humility. So you might be an expert in a certain area, and by no means should you discount your knowledge in that space, but you may not have all the answers, and you certainly don't in all domains. And so as a leader, what we're seeing is a lot more leaders embracing the uncertain, because they have to in this market, and expressing and exposing their own vulnerability by saying, I don't have all the answers here, and leveraging the smart and intelligent, creative people within the organization to align around the mission. And this, I'm going back to the value equation that you are a big proponent of, John, and the A in the value equation is alignment. And we've talked about this prior to the webinar here today. And that's what I think leaders are embracing as their challenges, to align their entire organization around the vision and the mission, and not always having the answer about how they're going to do that.
And if you think about all of the people that you work with, and you know, not an absolute statistic here, but just a sense of where the leadership teams are on that acknowledgement of embracing, of creating the kind of environment they need to create. You know, is it the 80-20 rule? Do we have, you know, 20% of the organizations are completely unprepared for the future and 80% are going to be okay? Or do you have any sense of the distribution of what you're looking at, or is it all over the map?
Well, I think it's a great question, and one that I'd love to give a really good data-driven answer about. And yet, I think our sample size is highly tainted in that the people that are coming to us, by and large, are the ones that are being humble and embracing their own situational humility, saying, hey, we need help, we need some coaching. And so by and large, all of the organizations that are working with us are in that place. And so, but I can't speak to the folks that we haven't engaged with, John.
Great point, great point. And I used to work with someone who used to have the expression that when times are difficult and you're facing really challenges like we are now, it's really important to, as a leader, to check your ego at the door. And I think, to your point, that the people who are working with you and reaching out to you and prepare for it have already figured out they have to do that. And it's, I think, the rest of the world that's going to have to figure that out. Leslie and Michael, your thoughts on that question as you look at leadership teams that you're working with, that you consult with. I mean, in so many industries. I know both of you work extensively in financial services. You work in, Michael, I know, in the sports arena, sports teams. It's a whole nother subject. We could probably do a whole webinar just on that in terms of the impact of sports and the culture. You know, your thoughts about what you're seeing with the leadership teams that you may be engaging with, and how they're preparing for this.
Leslie, do you want to start, or should
You go ahead, Michael.
Okay. Well, I'll just say briefly that, you know, to me, one of the biggest, in my opinion, the biggest transformation in marketing over the last 10 to 20 years has been the engagement of the consumer, the end consumer, in the decision-making process, and the interest of consumers in being engaged in that. And we know that when consumers are involved in, you know, whether it's creating the marketing messaging or submitting ideas for new products, whatever, their level of involvement really ramps up, and that actually impacts ROI. And so I from my perspective, you know, I take the side, sort of the side of the consumer. I think there needs to be more direct involvement of your customers in leadership decisions, because what tends to happen is that, and you know, there's a lot of companies that are figuring out that they need to integrate the voice of the consumer much more, but still plenty left. And John, I don't know if it's 80 or 20 left or whatever, but there's plenty of them, you know, where people are kind of sitting in their office, or I guess at home now, and they're basically saying, yeah, I think this is the way that, you know, my customers would react to what we're doing, the decisions we're making, rather than really giving them a seat at the table. And so if you embrace, a lot of companies are reluctant to kind of let people look under the kimono and see what's going on before everything is perfectly developed. But nowadays, everything is in beta. You have to think of it that way. And so I don't see why leadership teams can't be the same way. I mean, new product development teams increasingly are embracing that idea, but I think to a large extent, again, there are exceptions, but leaders tend to barricade themselves and not really get out there and do kind of, you know, management by walking around or marketing by walking around, if you will. So that would be the one thing, the one suggestion I would make is value your customers as the most powerful sales force you have, as co-creators in the process, and don't be afraid to involve them.
Right.
Yeah, I totally agree with Michael. Once again, all of the work that we do is actually co-creation, which is, so it's interesting that you should say that. And I'm in a little bit of the same situation as Stephan, in that the clients that work with us are those that want to engage in that co-creation process. The fascinating thing about co-creation is that when companies come up with ideas and then even they go test them, they only kind of reach this level. But when you co-create with consumers, you can actually reach the ideal. And a great example of this is what we're learning in the area of safety, which is obviously very important right now. So we work with a lot of retailers, and we're finding that the consumer's perspective on what an ideal safety scenario is completely different than what the leadership thinks is the ideal safety scenario. Because really companies try to create something that will be satisfactory, but they can't really imagine what the ideal would be. And so if companies really want to get credit for making people feel safe and make them feel comfortable getting out there and going to hotels and airlines and restaurants, they're going to need to over-impress the consumer. The consumer's going to need to walk out of there saying, wow, they did more than I could possibly imagine, more than I would have ever thought. And I don't mean just wiping down a counter. They're going to have to go a lot further than that. In terms of industries, I think the one thing that concerns me is that the companies that are having a bump right now because of transactional sales, those are not necessarily going to be permanent. So crisis customers are coming in and they're overbuying, as Michael said earlier, and panic buying. That's not true consumer choice. That is just merely a superficial transaction. And my one concern about sort of the big legacy brands is that they may just be happy with that and assume that that growth will continue, when what they really need to do is figure out how to hold on to those people and transfer them into people who really prefer their brands. And I think the industries that may actually end up being in the best shape, keeping my fingers crossed for them if they do it right, are the airlines and the insurance companies, and the companies that had systemic issues all along. And they should have been improving their customer experience and their customer loyalty and their relationships all along, but they didn't, because it's hard. It's hard to move a big ship around. But I'm hoping that COVID will be the catalyst for those companies to engage in some real self-examination. This is the time for reinvention, and they're going to need to, reinvent everything in a very 360 way. So I'm hoping that if they do it right, they can actually emerge healthier than ever.
We are all hoping that, right? We are all hoping that, and we're all going to try to help make that happen any way we can. Simon, I think it's time for me to pass the moderation baton to you. And before you lead the questions from the audience, I think you had one particular question for Stephan that we want to make sure is addressed. So take it away, Simon.
Stephan, I think that the question really is about the role of diversity in terms of thinking and approach and how we think about this. I suppose in a way, really, we look at COVID as a behavioral change moment. You add on top everything that's been going on around Black Lives Matter, greater recognition of racism. That is another very significant behavioral change issue that companies need to be thinking about. So how does diversity, how should people be thinking about diversity in this broader context?
That's a good question. And certainly what we're seeing, because the people that we interact with in organizations is often the learning and development manager or someone within the HR function. And they definitely feel the pressure of whatever is happening in society, it gets reflected back on them, right? So if leadership is saying, okay, we need to include more diversity in our leadership or within our people, then it's HR and L&D that are the folks that are responsible for making that happen within the organization. And what I think is so interesting about it is if you look at psychological safety and developing a fearless organization, what the research and evidence is pretty clear about is that the teams and the organizations that are diverse and inclusive, they perform better. So I think for an organization, we want to include diverse opinions, and in an organization where people feel like they can speak up and say what's on their mind and they're celebrated for their differences, then that's a wonderful environment for innovation and for creative output. And that's where I think organizations need to go. It's not just about the warm and fuzzies about, hey, you know, we employ a lot of minorities, for example. It's good business. It will lead to better results if you can not just hire those folks, minorities, and but to really embrace what they uniquely bring to the table. And I know for me, I'm you know, a white guy who's been able to grow up with all sorts of privileges, and I think another factor with diversity and inclusion that is facing organizations is they're not totally sure. All the leaders within that organization are not necessarily sure how to even speak about these issues. And so there's a general, I say, an invitation that I have for the audience here to have open conversation within your organizations, create environments where folks can speak up and express their vulnerabilities and express their concerns they're having or they have. And because we're seeing that on the front lines, we're seeing leaders who are stressed and concerned about what they're saying, how they're saying it, making sure that everybody within their organization is feeling safe and secure so that the output can increase, so that they can be agile and innovative.
You know, I was yesterday actually talking to a colleague of mine who's African American, and one of the conversations that we had was, why has nothing changed? We've been talking about diversity for 20 years. Why has nothing changed? You know, is what we're going through right now, maybe, Michael, this is an example of the freezing, unfreezing moment in some shape or form. And maybe, Leslie, you've got some thoughts in terms of, you know, are we at a moment when it comes to diversity and when it comes to what we're talking about, this broader conversation, that maybe change will actually take place? So maybe, Michael, what's your perspective? And then Leslie, maybe you can kind of chime in.
Yeah, you know, it's kind of tempting to think about the old tipping point. You know, the phenomenon that Malcolm Gladwell popularized. It was around before that, but he made money on the idea that we've reached this tipping point, and it does take that certain degree of momentum, and perhaps there's a perfect storm because it's happening in the context of all these other changes, and you know, this unfreezing again, without beating that to death, but it is a unique moment in time, and I think Leslie was saying this as well. You know, this is one of those moments that does not happen very often, and you know, as I said at the beginning, you know, never waste a good crisis, and because there's plenty of bad stuff going on, but it's very exciting. You know, we were saying earlier, this Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. This is an interesting time. It's really a watershed moment where you are reaching that tipping point, and so we may actually see some real change.
I certainly agree, and I hope so. I do have a very particular perspective on why we haven't made progress, though, to answer Simon's question. Because we have had diversity and inclusion programs for a very long time, and we need them, but that is the top-down approach. What nobody is really addressing, well, it started to be addressed, but I don't think it's as comprehensive as it needs to be, is the unconscious bias that really does fuel all types of racism. Institutional racism, internally mediated racism, they're all fueled by unconscious bias. And what we've been doing up until now is we've been trying to persuade people and companies to do the right things. And all we're doing is really attacking the conscious mind, which is resistant and skeptical and doesn't like to change. But if you think about where racism forms, it's just the same way brands form, or the same way COVID formed. It's, you know, a little sapling, and more branches and more associations form little by little by little by little, negative associations, and they mount up, and suddenly you have a racist mind. You have a biased mind. And we have to address racism at the source, where those associations form in the first place. And that's the only way we're really going to make true progress. So hopefully that is some of the work that companies will be engaged in at this point.
You know, I wonder if there are, you know, with people who work for, let's say, communications agencies, heads of corporate communications, heads of marketing, are there, and strategy folks who are on the webinar, are there specific things that maybe tie into the COVID reset, the sort of reset that we may be going through right now when it comes to thinking about racism? Are there things that people could take away now and say, okay, knowing this conversation, the behavioral context to it, do you have recommendations? And maybe we can just sort of quickly go through you in terms of specific things folks should actually be doing. Go, after this webinar, here's some very specific things you should actually do, conversations you should have. Maybe we can start, maybe Michael will start with you, and then we'll work back to you, Stephan.
Okay, sure. Well, first, to build on what Leslie was saying, you know, with all of those issues, one thing that's important is really to understand a little bit about neuroscience and how the brain works, because when the way our brains are wired is we categorize everything. As soon as we perceive, whether it's a person or a brand, we put it into a category and we assign it a label. And so a lot of this implicit bias that she's talking about is at a level that most people are not aware of consciously. This is something, and Leslie, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I think that's what you're talking about. And so understanding those very basic mechanisms is really important, you know. And but more generally, you know, I think we know that brands succeed when they're linked to core values that people have. And so, as I was saying earlier, you know, when you understand what's going on in a culture, and adopt a cultural perspective in terms of what are the driving values that you can link your brand to. So in recent years, for example, wellness has been a huge pillar of consumer behavior. And a lot of brands have been successful, whether it's Peloton or what have you, by linking to that. So you don't just throw stuff out there and hope it sticks. You really have to start with the basics. And, you know, some of these drivers that I had suggested, like gratification, agency, and stability, and so on. These are examples where if you can find growth opportunities that directly gratify those underlying values, you'll have a much better shot at making things stick, as opposed to some of the ad hoc buying that Leslie was referring to.
Leslie, some additional thoughts?
I would just say that the way to address racism and the way to get over COVID is to replace negative with positive associations. You can't get rid of a negative association by telling somebody, you know, don't be racist. You know, this brand does not have artificial colors. They won't believe you, and all you're actually doing is making that negative association grow. So, you know, one quick trick is to replace all negative with positive associations, and that's for brands, it's for racism, it's for getting people to come out of hiding during COVID. And the other thing to do, and this goes back to what Michael was saying, is you want to piggyback on things that people already know, and piggyback on positive themes that are already in their consciousness. Because what relevance is all about is connecting your brand to what exists in consumers' brain. And when there's a perfect match, that is the definition of emotional connection. And it's actually when your brand becomes their go-to brand. So those are my two suggestions for something that people can take home with them.
Stephan, some thoughts?
Yeah, well, I agree with Leslie in that you want to tackle bias at the root. And one way that I'd invite leaders, especially within organizations, is to set the stage and invite participation with your teams. So it's going back to that humility piece. So demonstrating situational humility and asking people within your organization what it's like for them within their teams, how safe they feel, how uniquely celebrated they feel as an individual, and can they be themselves within their organization, and just have an open and candid conversation. You're not trying to provide answers. You're just trying to be a set of ears and get the real pulse of what's happening within your organization, how folks are feeling within that organization.
Simon, I have, I'm looking at the time, and we need to begin thinking about coming to closure, but there's a question that I would like to pose to each of the panelists that we have not really discussed at all. A number of people on this call are work for nonprofit organizations. As I said, we in the council are relevant when we try to address the needs of both for-profits and nonprofits. But there's also a number of people on the call who they might not work for a nonprofit, but they might be on the board, the advisory board in some way, whether it's a local nonprofit or a national or even international. And I wonder how you all are thinking about the changes that are occurring and how much of what we're talking about can apply directly to those nonprofit organizations that are so reliant on donations. Because one of the things that I worry about quite a bit, we've done a lot of work in that area over the years, is the fact that you've got a combined effect of both people having less disposable income in some ways to be donating, or at least less certainty about their disposable income of the future, so they're holding on to it longer, and their brains are shifting and in terms of what they do want to connect with, in terms of causes they might want to support because of COVID, because of the healthcare industry, et cetera. So when you think about this broad area of nonprofits, from your perspective, I know how I feel about it, but from your perspective, each of you, do you believe that much of what we're talking about is directly translatable to how you think about running a nonprofit and what you do for the brand of that nonprofit? Or is there something specifically different that they ought to be considering as well? Leslie, maybe I start with you.
Sure. Look, I think it's exactly the same. I think of nonprofits as brands, just like I think of business-to-business companies as brands and CPG as brands. And I think that the opportunity here is that we are in a time of tremendous volatility, and people are creating new relationships with brands and trying new things, and connecting with causes that they feel emotionally connected to, really like never before. So I do think it's a tremendous opportunity. I think COVID has a silver lining. The COVID cloud has a silver lining, I think, for a lot of companies. And I think that's very true for nonprofits. And while our disposable income may be contracting and there are less funds around, all that really means is that the nonprofit has to make itself more relevant at this time. And so if you look at the branches of the COVID Connectome, or you look at the themes that are emerging, the instincts, the behaviors that are emerging now, what those nonprofits need to do is to connect back to those themes, to make themselves more relevant and more prominent in people's minds.
Michael, any thoughts?
I was just thinking, I wish I had $1 for every student who has said to me, well, I'm going to work for a nonprofit, so I don't really need to know anything about marketing. I agree totally with Leslie that conceptually there's really no difference, and it's actually, in terms of opportunities in a crisis, that's one of them, because I think we are seeing a shift in values. How long it will last, I don't know, but people that maybe were devoting more of their discretionary income to, let's say, the apparel industry, which is totally devastated right now, they're going to be looking for other opportunities. But again, that authenticity aspect has to be there. And I just, for what it's worth, I think in some ways social media is the worst enemy of nonprofits, because what happens psychologically is when people like a cause, they kind of mentally check it off the list and they don't actually do anything else with it. And John, I know you've done a lot more in this area, but that's my perception. So when nonprofits are figuring out how to message about this, I think they should probably avoid some of these popularity contests where you just get people to like something, and think of more proactive kinds of activities, like maybe that, like the ice bucket challenge from a few years ago, or something that really does have more of an impact.
Stephan, any thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same, profit or not for profit. And I'm going to go back to the concept of alignment. So it's about aligning the entire workforce within an organization to be able to execute on the vision, the opportunity that exists. And like Michael and Leslie have mentioned, that the market is changing a little bit for not-for-profits and the way people relate to brands. And so there's an opportunity, right? As the ice is now melted and will refreeze again, perhaps, there's opportunity there, but you want to make sure that your people internally are aligned on the same values, and that can happen through, like I said, open conversation, embracing humility from the leadership, so that everybody, it can come from the bottom up as well as the top down, with what kind of ways that the organization can seize on the opportunities that are in the marketplace.
John, I know we need to wrap, but but we have to there are a couple of questions that I just want to acknowledge.
Sure. That
are related to, as we were looking at Black Lives Matter, or as we were looking about systemic racism, they were actually addressing both that there is an individual component to this and a societal component. Mm-hmm. And both of them were actually kind of in different ways making the point that as we look at media images, or as we think about these broader contexts of society, there's a bigger context than the individuals of what we can do as individuals in that. I think we'll probably try and reach out to all of our panelists just to get some additional perspective. So in the summary recap, we can get your thoughts on some of those things, unless it's something very quick. And John, it's up to you.
No, that's great. I think I actually was just going to say that I appreciate the questions that the audience has been providing, and I think what we need to do is since we've promised everyone that we'd wrap this up within an hour, respect the audience's time, but also we'll try to be sure to incorporate thoughts, responses in that, and to the subsequent communications that we provide. I know, Simon, you always do a recap of this. We will be reaching out to the panelists if there's anything that they think we really missed today that they would have liked to have time to communicate. We'll make sure we try to incorporate that in the recap. And to try to tie things together here, I think what we heard is that today is that the reset here, the COVID-19 driven reset, is not only a requirement for all leaders to address, but also an opportunity for leaders and their teams, both internal and external teams, all of the resources that they rely on to get anything done, to really engage at all levels and to really directly connect strategy, marketing, and communications, and to maximize value and really rooted in a clear understanding of these behavioral changes and their potential impact on growth. And again, as we've said today, it's not just the COVID reset, it's the issue of racism, it's the issue of the complete unrest that we seem to have, and in many ways where the wheels are falling off in a lot of places, how do we put them back on, and how do we move forward in a constructive way that does require the participation of both individuals and company leadership teams and everybody, every stakeholder that they draw on to address. It is not something that one person alone can attack, but yet every individual needs to be doing their part in doing so. They can't be leaving it to someone else to handle. The point that, Michael, I think you made about the nonprofit, the social media implication of that, doing your part to support a nonprofit is not necessarily just checking off a like. It's really figuring out, how do I do something? So I think we all have to be asking ourselves, what can we each do as individuals, and how do we bring those who we can influence, those who we can bring together, the things that we can control, bring them together in a way that's constructive. So on behalf of Simon and myself and our supporting partners and everyone in the audience today, I really want to thank all three of our panelists for sharing their valuable time and perspective and insights and guidance with us at this critical reset point in each of our journeys. I would like to note quickly that another one of the Council's strategic partners, West Express, has organized a free webinar for tomorrow, the 25th at 3 p.m., titled Marketing in the Shadow of COVID-19, in which Professor Jeremy Kagan of Columbia Business School is going to discuss digital marketing strategies during the pandemic. And that's very appropriate given what we're talking here about social as well, in all of the area of digital. What's appropriate, what's not, what works, what doesn't. So if you're interested but can't make it, and with the short notice here, if you hadn't heard of this already, register anyway, and Wessex will be happy to send you a recording of the session, and you can register very easily in the events section of the Council website. So in any case, we're really looking forward to engaging with everyone with us today in some form again soon. And in the meantime, we wish you all the very, very best. Thank you very much.